Outside the Grand Palace of Westminster, the heart of British governance, stands an imposing bronze statue. A crowned king, sword held high, sits astride a powerful war horse. It's a potent symbol of English monarchy, of martial valor, and of national pride. The man immortalized is King Richard I, known to history as Coeur de Lion, the Lion Heart. Yet, this quintessential image of an English hero conceals a startling paradox. During a 10-year reign from 1189 to 1199, this legendary king spent, by most historical estimates, a grand total of 6 months on English soil. How did a man so physically detached from England become one of its most enduring national symbols? It's a story of identity, empire, and continental ambition. To understand why Richard was an absentee king, we must first accept that he was never truly an English king to begin with. Richard was born in Oxford in September 1157, a fact that ties him geographically to England from his first breath. But this detail is misleading, and his world was thoroughly and unalterably French. His parents were Henry II, the first Plantagenet king of England, and the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine. Both were of French birth and culture. Neither spoke English, and the language of their court was French. While Richard spent his earliest years in England with an English wet nurse named Hodierna, this interlude was brief. At the age of 7, he was taken to the continent, and it was there, in the sun-drenched lands of southern France, that his identity was forged. The defining relationship of Richard's life wasn't with his powerful but often adversarial father, but with his mother, Eleanor. Richard was her favorite son, the child who most resembled her in temperament and spirit. From 1168, Eleanor took up residence in her ancestral Duchy of Aquitaine, a vast and wealthy territory that was hers by right. She kept Richard by her side, deliberately grooming him to be her heir and the future ruler of this fiercely independent land. At just 14, he was formally invested as Duke of Aquitaine. He grew up immersed in the sophisticated culture of southern France, a world of chivalric knights, courtly love, and troubadours. This was arguably the most stereotypically high medieval location imaginable, and it couldn't have been more different from England. He wasn't just a consumer of this pinnacle of high medieval culture. He was a participant, composing his own poetry and songs in French and the local dialect. Aquitaine wasn't just a territory he was assigned to govern. By all accounts, he considered it his true home. To grasp Richard's priorities, one must understand the political entity he was born to rule. It wasn't a unified nation-state in the modern sense. Historians call it the Angevin Empire, a sprawling collection of territories held together not by a common identity, but by personal allegiance to a single family, the Plantagenets. This quote-unquote empire stretched from the borders of Scotland down to the Pyrenees Mountains, encompassing all of England, Ireland, and more than half of modern France. In fact, the family's continental possessions were significantly larger than England itself. Richard ruled these lands under different titles. He was king in England, but in France, he was Duke of Normandy, Duke of Aquitaine, and Count of Anjou. Interestingly, this made him a vassal of the French king for those French lands. England was just one piece, albeit a wealthy and prestigious one, in a vast cross-channel patchwork of personal domains. The modern criticism of Richard as a bad English king for his absenteeism is therefore anachronistic. It imposes the expectations of a modern nation-state onto a medieval feudal reality. Richard's identity was forged in Aquitaine. His primary political power base was on the continent, and his most cherished inheritance came from his mother. His domains were vast and constantly threatened, particularly in France, and spending the majority of one's time defending those continental heartlands wasn't neglect. It was the fundamental job description of a feudal king to protect his subjects. In this system, his English subjects had no particular precedence over his continental subjects, and from a personal perspective, he likely felt more connection to his French subjects. Fundamentally, Richard was an Angevin prince, who also happened to wear the English crown. When Richard was finally crowned King of England in September 1889, his mind wasn't on English governance. Instead, it was thousands of miles away, in the Holy Land. His one, all-consuming ambition was to take up the cross and lead the Third Crusade to recapture Jerusalem, which had fallen to the great Sultan Saladin in 1187. This personal obsession was the primary driver for his first, longest, and most famous absence. After his coronation, he remained in England only long enough to prepare for this conflict, departing in the summer of 1190. He would not set foot in the kingdom again for more than 4 years. To finance an enterprise as colossal as a crusade, Richard treated England with the unsentimental pragmatism of a banker. He viewed the kingdom as a cash cow, a source of funds to be milked for his grander purposes. He was able to do this because England possessed a remarkably efficient and centralized system of administration and taxation. This was a legacy of his Norman predecessors that was unmatched in most of his French domains. While his French domains may have technically been far wealthier, as a percentage of economic output, less of this ended up in the royal coffers comparatively. Richard's fundraising campaign was swift and ruthless. He emptied the royal treasury, which his father had filled with funds from a special Saladin tithe, which was collected almost exclusively in England in 1188. He raised taxes and sold off anything of value. Official positions, lands, and other royal privileges were auctioned to the highest bidder. In a move that demonstrated both his focus and his detachment, he sold Scotland's oath of subservience back to its king, William the Lion, for an extremely hefty sum. As later scholars have noted, he likely would have sold London itself if there was anyone who could afford it. The crusade itself explains not only the duration of his absence, but also why his return would be so fraught with peril. He proved himself a military commander of considerable genius. On his way to the Holy Land, he conquered the kingdoms of Sicily and Cyprus, securing vital supply lines. He arrived at the long-stalled siege of Acre in June 1191, and with his energy and expertise, brought it to a successful conclusion within weeks. He then led the Crusaders to a brilliant victory over Saladin's forces at the Battle of Arsuf. Yet, the ultimate prize, Jerusalem, remained out of reach. More damaging in the long run, however, were the powerful enemies he made among his supposed allies. He deeply offended King Philip II of France, his chief rival, who abandoned the crusade early to return to France and plot against him. At the siege of Acre, he publicly humiliated Duke Leopold of Austria by tearing down his banner, an act of arrogance that the Duke would neither forgive nor forget. This act of extreme disrespect would be a direct cause of Richard's further absence from his holdings. Richard's journey home in late 1192 was a desperate affair. With the French king blocking the direct sea routes, he was forced to take a perilous path up the Adriatic Sea. A storm wrecked his ship, forcing him and a few attendants to travel overland in disguise, straight through the territory of his new enemy, Duke Leopold of Austria. Duke Leopold was, to put it extremely mildly, extremely upset at the level of disrespect he had been shown at the siege. In December 1192, near Vienna, the disguise failed. The King of England was captured and thrown into Leopold's castle at Dürnstein. Soon after, he was sold like a prize commodity to an even more powerful foe, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who also bore a grudge against the Plantagenets. Richard's imprisonment created a dangerous power vacuum that his enemies rushed to fill. His own brother John, whom Richard had never fully trusted, saw his chance to seize power. John formed a treacherous alliance with King Philip of France. While Richard languished in a German prison, Philip launched a full-scale assault on Richard's vital territories in Normandy, and John attempted to raise a rebellion in England. The two even conspired together and offered the emperor a truly massive sum of money to prolong Richard's captivity. And I'm not exaggerating here, they offered the Holy Roman Emperor 18 tons of silver just to prolong the event. In modern terms, this silver would be worth $20 billion today. However, to use more relevant contemporary comparisons, historians have estimated that this amount could fund 10,000 knights and their households for 1 year. In essence, the future King John and King Philip were willing to hand over extreme wealth to their already extremely powerful neighbor. But then things got worse, and the price to actually win Richard's freedom was beyond staggering. Emperor Henry VI demanded 3 times the entire annual income of the English crown, the equivalent of almost 40 tons of silver. And at this point, I need to remind everyone that this could have all been avoided if Richard simply respected Duke Leopold's flag at the siege they won together. In terms of monetary value, Richard's lapse of judgment or extreme pride may have been the most expensive act of disrespect in human history. Raising this ransom placed a crippling burden on England. It required a 25% tax on all income and property, the confiscation of gold and silver treasures from every church in the land, and other special levies. For the second time in less than 5 years, the kingdom's wealth was drained to fund its absent king's foreign affairs. The conspiracy between John and Philip revealed the inherent weakness of the Angevin Empire, and also reveals why many historians are uncomfortable with the term empire for it. It was a dominion held together only by the personal authority and presence of its ruler, with each component maintaining its independence outside the personal union. Richard's time in England as king consisted of 2 fleeting visits. The first was for his coronation, and to launch his crusade fundraising, lasting from September 1189 to the summer of 1190. His second visit was even shorter and somehow even more businesslike. Ransomed and released, he finally landed in England in March 1194. He stayed just long enough to perform a second symbolic coronation to erase the humiliation of his captivity and to formally forgive his treacherous brother John. However, the main purpose of his visit, and why he had to issue the apologies, was because he was really in England to gather even more money. He was about to take the fight back to King Philip, his arch-nemesis, and by May 1194, he had sailed from Portsmouth to France, never to return. The final 5 years of Richard's life were consumed by a single grinding purpose: fighting a relentless battle against Philip II to reclaim his lost French lands. While many modern people see this as yet another foreign adventure, to Richard this was a battle for his homeland. Normandy was the ancestral core of the Angevin inheritance, and Aquitaine was his personal domain and the land of his youth. He was fighting to defend the territories that defined him, his family, and his power. In this final campaign, his martial genius was on full display, and he systematically reversed many of Philip's gains and fortified his lands. Fittingly, Richard would perish in the heart of his French domains. In April 1199, while besieging the minor castle of Chalus-Chabrol in Limousin, part of his beloved Aquitaine, he was struck by a crossbow bolt. His body wasn't brought back to England, but rather, he was buried at Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou, forever cementing his identity as a great continental lord of the Angevin dynasty. The historical consensus is clear. Richard the Lionheart wasn't a bad king in general, but perhaps was a bad ruler of his English holdings in particular. He was a masterful soldier king and a shrewd leader capable of inspiring extreme loyalty and commanding the respect of both his friends and foes. His priorities, the crusade and the defense of his French lands, were perfectly logical for a 12th century Christian warrior prince. He was a product of the Angevin political system, a French feudal lord first, an English king second. Ironically, it was Richard's very absence that secured his legendary status in England. He wasn't present to be blamed for high taxes or the mundane struggles of governance. Instead, he became an idealized, offstage hero, the good King Richard of the Robin Hood legends. He was a perfect and romanticized foil to his brother John, whose tyrannical and disastrous reign was an all-too-present reality for the English people. Richard the Lionheart was, in essence, the cool, absentee dad of medieval England. His rare visits home were dramatic. He'd return like a hero, raise money for his campaigns, or resolve disputes with flair, then head back out. He'd also tell some cool stories about his conquests, and promise that if you just gave him some funding, he'd come back and tell even more cool stories in the future. Meanwhile, his younger brother John was stuck as the everyday parent, enforcing rules, collecting taxes, and making unpopular decisions. And quite frankly, John was terrible at this, both while he was filling in for his brother and while ruling in his own right. My personal opinion is that without the disastrous rule of King John, Richard would have been remembered simply as a warrior king, rather than as a legendary national hero of England. After all, Richard was a great ruler in many respects, but it's hard to make the argument that he acted in the best interests of England in a way that would earn national hero status. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just reminding you to like and subscribe, and also to share this video. Also, if you're in the mood for something different, check out my other YouTube channels or my podcast by clicking the links or in the description below. Imagine a world that no longer exists. Not the drained, orderly farmland of modern East Anglia, but a primeval landscape from the 11th century. It was a watery wilderness of swamps, treacherous bogs, and vast, rustling reed beds that stretched to the horizon. This was the Fens, a bewildering labyrinth where mist clung to the water, and solid ground was often an illusion. It was a place where rivers disappeared into murky lakes, and isolated islands of clay rose like ships from a stagnant sea. Survival here didn't depend on the brute force of armies, but on an intimate knowledge of the secret paths and hidden waterways. This landscape was a character in itself, a natural fortress that bred a unique kind of person and a unique kind of rebel. From this mist, a figure emerges, not clearly at first, but like a ghost. He is the embodiment of a conquered people's defiance, the last flicker of resistance against an unstoppable new order. This man is Herewald, a name that would echo through the centuries, later earning the epithet the Wake, which may have meant the Watchful. He stands balanced precariously between documented history and swirling myth. He's a man whose real existence is confirmed by the cold records of his conquerors, yet whose life story is heavily woven from folklore and legend. This raises the central questions that have fascinated historians for centuries. How did a single dispossessed landowner from Lincolnshire become the last best hope for Anglo-Saxon England? Was he a patriotic hero fighting for a lost cause, a ruthless opportunist driven by personal revenge, or something more complex? To understand Herewald, we first have to understand the cataclysm that created him. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy crossed the English Channel, and at the Battle of Hastings, he shattered the Anglo-Saxon army and eliminated its king, Harold Godwinson. By Christmas Day of that year, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, but his victory was far from complete. What followed wasn't just a change of monarch, it was a systematic and brutal dismantling of an entire world. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was almost completely erased, its lands carved up and handed to about 180 of William's most loyal Norman tenants-in-chief. Norman French became the language of the court, of law, and of power, while the English vernacular was relegated to the conquered masses. Across the country, Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots were replaced by Norman clerics, seizing control of the church, one of the most powerful institutions of the age. This societal revolution created a deep well of resentment and a class of dispossessed and furious English nobles and local lords. These lords, known as thanes, weren't prepared to take the upending of their social order lightly, and rebellion was inevitable. In the years immediately following the conquest, uprisings flared across the kingdom. William's response to these challenges was swift and merciless. His campaign to crush the northern rebellions, known as the Harrying of the North, was an act of incredible brutality that laid waste to vast swathes of Yorkshire and beyond. By the time Harold began his fight, he was not the first to resist, but he would be the last to lead a large-scale, organized rebellion against the conqueror. Our firmest anchor to his existence comes from the conquerors themselves. The Domesday Book, William's great survey of his new kingdom compiled in 1086, records a man named Harold as a landowner in southwestern Lincolnshire before the conquest. He held lands as a tenant of the powerful abbeys of Peterborough and Croyland, placing him squarely in the fenlands he would later make his fortress. This is the bedrock of fact upon which the legend is built. His parentage, however, is a matter of intense debate. The earliest detailed account of his life, a 12th century Latin text called the Gesta Herowardi, names his father as Leofric of Bourne, a local Lincolnshire nobleman. Later, more romantic tales tried to connect him to the famous Earl Leofric of Mercia and his wife, Lady Godiva, but there is no historical evidence to support this prestigious lineage. More compelling is a modern theory suggesting he was of Anglo-Danish heritage. This theory claims that his father was a prominent Danish thane named Asketil. This connection isn't a minor biographical detail. It's the geopolitical key that unlocks the strategy of his entire rebellion. It explains how an otherwise obscure local lord could summon a Danish fleet to his aid, attempting to reignite the old Anglo-Scandinavian alliance that the Norman conquest had shattered. His fight was not just for a lost England, but for a lost Anglo-Norse world order. According to the Gesta, Harold was a handsome, bold, but fiercely rebellious youth. His disruptive behavior was so extreme that his own father petitioned King Edward the Confessor to have him declared an outlaw and banished from the kingdom at the age of 18. It was during this exile that he forged himself into the warrior who would later defy the Normans. He traveled to Flanders, where he became a highly successful and respected mercenary in the service of Count Baldwin V. The stories from this period are filled with legendary embellishments, including a story about him combating a giant bear. Harold returned to England sometime between 1067 and 1069, a seasoned warrior returning to a home he no longer recognized. He found his family's lands seized and given to a Norman lord, his father dead, and his brother slain. In fact, according to the Gesta, his brother's severed head was impaled on a spike at the gate of their own home, as a grim warning. This deeply personal tragedy was the spark that ignited the Fenland Rebellion. The Gesta tells a story of brutal, symbolic revenge. Harold, with a small band of followers, is said to have infiltrated a feast where the Normans responsible were celebrating their new acquisitions. Finding them drunk and mocking the English, he exacted his vengeance, slaughtering 15 of them and replacing his brother's head on the gate with those men. This act, whether entirely factual or not, became a foundational legend of his resistance. From this moment of personal vengeance, the rebellion grew. Herewald established his base of operations on the Isle of Ely, a large clay island that was a natural fortress, surrounded by the impassable marshes and waterways of the fens. It quickly became a magnet for the last remnants of Anglo-Saxon resistance. The crucial moment came in 1070, when King Svein II of Denmark, sensing opportunity in the English turmoil, sent a fleet to the English coast. Herewald, likely leveraging his Anglo-Danish heritage, forged an alliance with them. Their first major joint operation was an attack on Peterborough Abbey in June 1070. This was a deeply controversial act, and the motivations were complex. The official justification was to, quote, rescue the abbey's vast treasures from the hands of its newly appointed Norman abbot. While this does sound like a very convenient excuse to steal large quantities of treasure from a sacred space, there was some truth to this. The Norman abbot who had been appointed to watch over the abbey was embezzling the funds it generated and making himself fabulously wealthy in the process. The raid on the Golden Borough, as Peterborough was known for its wealth, was a stunning success. Unfortunately for the Anglo-Saxons, the Danes, having secured an immense hoard of gold and silver, got in touch with their Viking heritage. They promptly accepted a bribe from King William, abandoned Herewald, and sailed for home, leaving the rebellion stripped of its main military force and its newfound treasury. This act of betrayal was a devastating blow. Despite the departure of the Danes, Herewald's defiance had captured the imagination of the beleaguered English. His reputation grew, and Ely became the final rallying point for those still willing to fight. The most significant figure to join him was Morcar, the former Earl of Northumbria, a high-ranking Anglo-Saxon noble who had been displaced by William's regime. Morcar's arrival, along with other fugitives, transformed Herewald's campaign from a local uprising into the last large-scale, organized Anglo-Saxon rebellion against Norman rule. However, the rebellion wasn't winning the hearts and minds of everyone in the Anglo-Saxon sphere. While the sacking of Peterborough had secured a fleeting victory, it came at a terrible cost. The act of desecrating one of England's holiest sites led to the excommunication of the band of patriotic rebels. It ensured that the primary record keepers of the age, the monks of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle at Peterborough, would forever paint him as a villain. He lost the narrative war, alienating potential pious supporters and tainting his legacy in the historical record for centuries to come. By 1061, William the Conqueror could no longer ignore the festering rebellion in the fens. Taking the threat with the utmost seriousness, he marched his army to the edge of the marshes and took personal command of the siege of Ely. What followed was a clash of worlds, the brute force of Europe's finest heavy cavalry and infantry against the cunning guerrilla tactics of a local leader using his environment as a weapon. The dramatic, if somewhat fantastical, accounts of the siege read like an epic. The Normans, accustomed to open field battles and sieges of castles, were utterly confounded by the terrain. Their first major effort involved constructing a massive timber causeway, said to be a mile long, to launch a direct assault on the island. The attempt ended in disaster when the structure collapsed under the weight of armored knights and their horses, sending hundreds of soldiers plunging into the swampy depths to drown. Herewald's tactics were born of this landscape. When the Normans tried again to build a causeway, Herewald had his men hide in the reeds and set them ablaze, engulfing the attackers in fire and smoke. Perhaps the most bizarre tale from the siege involves the Normans resorting to psychological warfare. They allegedly constructed a wooden siege tower and placed a witch atop it to hurl curses and spells at the English defenders. In a moment of pure folklore, Herewald and his men reportedly managed to set fire to the tower, causing it to collapse and eliminate the witch. These stories, while likely embellished, speak to the perception of Herewald as a resourceful and cunning leader, capable of outwitting his powerful foe at every turn. In the end, however, the fortress of reeds fell not to Norman swords, but to Norman silver. Frustrated by his military failures, William turned to a more subtle weapon: bribery. He approached the monks of Ely Abbey, who, perhaps fearing the destruction of their monastery or seeing the futility of the resistance, accepted his offer. They betrayed Herewald and showed the Norman army a secret, safe path through the marshes. This act of treachery sealed the rebellion's fate. William's victory demonstrated a core tenet of his statecraft. Subversion and the exploitation of internal divisions are equally effective tools of conquest. Surrounded and betrayed, the stronghold was finally captured. Earl Morcar was taken prisoner and would spend the rest of his life in a Norman dungeon. But in one last, legendary act of defiance, Herewald and a small band of his most loyal followers slipped through the Norman lines, vanished into the wild fens, and escaped. This final escape, noted in all the earliest sources, was the moment the man disappeared and the myth was born. What happened to Herewald the Wake after his dramatic escape from Ely? His disappearance created a vacuum that was eagerly filled by storytellers, each crafting an ending that suited their own time and political purpose. Two main contradictory narratives emerged in the decades that followed. The Gesta, written in the early 12th century, provides the most romantic conclusion, fitting of a heroic fighter who comes to accept that the new order can't be overthrown. In this version, Herewald eventually attempts to make peace with King William. He's provoked into a fight, captured, and imprisoned, but is soon freed in a daring rescue by his loyal followers. His former jailer, impressed by Herewald's character, speaks to the king on his behalf. William, respecting the spirit of his indomitable foe, finally pardons him. Herewald is allowed to reclaim his lands and live out the rest of his days in peace, even marrying a wealthy Anglo-Saxon noble widow named Alftruda. And yeah, I suppose I probably didn't have to specify that a woman named Alftruda was an Anglo-Saxon. And as a brief aside, I have to wonder when the last time a baby was named Alftruda, though I suppose I could be inviting a Bort situation in the comments here. A darker, more tragic ending is offered by the Anglo-Norman poet Geoffrey Gaimar in his History of the English, written around 1140. He claims that Herewald lived for a time as an outlaw in the woods and fens. As he was on the verge of finally making peace with the king, he was ambushed and treacherously slain by a group of vengeful Norman knights. According to this version, they couldn't forgive the losses he had inflicted upon them. Lacking any definitive evidence for either of these literary accounts, the modern historical consensus is more prosaic. Most historians believe the most plausible scenario is that Herewald simply succeeded in his escape. He likely fled to the continent, living out his life as an exile, his ultimate fate unknown and unrecorded. He vanished from the pages of history, becoming a blank slate onto which later generations could project their own hopes, fears, and ideals. This version of events is supported by the fact that Herwald definitely had connections to the continent. Fleeing the British Isles entirely would put significant distance between himself and his Norman foes. Herwald's journey from a documented Lincolnshire thane to an enduring national folk hero is a testament to the power of resistance. The verifiable facts of his life, his landholdings, his exile, and his leadership of the Ely Rebellion provided the historical nucleus around which a much larger legend could grow. In the centuries that followed, he became a potent symbol of Anglo-Saxon defiance against what became known as the Norman yoke, the sense of oppression felt by the conquered English. His story of a dispossessed noble fighting injustice from a hidden base in the wilderness established a powerful archetype in English folklore. He is, in many ways, a clear forerunner to the Greenwood outlaws who would follow, most famously Robin Hood. In the end, Herwald's failure was inevitable from the moment the Danes withdrew their tepid support for his campaign. He was a man fighting against the unstoppable tide of history, a local leader standing against the organized might of a new and ruthless state. Yet his legacy endures not because he won, but because he fought. He represents that timeless spirit of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. His very elusiveness in the historical record is the ultimate source of his power as a legend, ensuring he would roam the misty marshes of England's collective memory forever.